Alright guys, how's it going? We've all got our own ideas on what makes a great game, and even what the greatest games of all time are. Clearly, nobody knows for certain though, as it's mostly opinion, and I'm quite sure no one has played every single game that was ever made. So I roll my eyes at top 10 best ever games lists, especially those comprising titles of the past 10 years alone. For sure, the production quality and stuff like user interfaces have improved drastically over the years. However, if you ask me what's most important in a game, then I'd say gameplay first, second and third, or perhaps story, depending on the game. I'd take both of those over graphics any day. My gaming career started very early. It would have been around 1980 and I'd have been around 5 years old when our family owned an Atari VCS. The main games I can remember were Combat, where two players fought each other with tanks and aircraft made out of square blocks. Star Wars The Empire Strikes Back and Moon Patrol were both pretty entertaining, but Joust here was probably the most fun game on the platform for me. I enjoyed playing them, but none of these games truly gripped me. They're all just too basic, and maybe I was too young as well. In 1982-83, previous to owning my own Spectrum, I had played on my friends' and also my cousin's Spectrum 48Ks, the first model with the rubber keys. I just knew I had to get one, and finally in 1984, my parents caved to the relentless pressure and bought me, for Christmas, my first home computer, the Sinclair ZX Spectrum 48K Plus. The early Spectrum games between 82 and 84 were still somewhat basic, literally, as many were written in the BASIC language, which I taught myself, aged around 8 or 9 years old. As time went on though, some real gems started to appear. Top of my list were titles such as Elite, of course, the famous BBC title which came to the Spectrum in 1985, allowing us to escape our galaxy for the first time in glorious wireframe 3D, and Turbo Esprit, often claimed as a forerunner to the Grand Theft Auto series. That launched in 1986 and was an important game from a technical standpoint, way ahead of its time, and presumed impossible on such a lowly computer. From a gameplay perspective, some real classics emerged from 87 onwards. Head Over Heels was a genius isometric 3D puzzle platform game, and is often cited as the greatest Spectrum game of all time. For sure it was one of mine, even though I wasn't all that good at it. Renegade in 1987 was another arcade beat-em-up title that I played heavily, as well as its successor, Target Renegade. Laser Squad? That was graphically backward for a Spectrum title of 1988, but it was a great strategy game created by Julian Gollop, who would go on to create the hugely successful XCOM series of games, in a similar mould. And last for the Spectrum, worth mentioning even if only for the graphics, was R-Type. This game blew me away when I first saw its graphics in an amusement arcade. The Spectrum could never match that quality of course, but check out how faithful to the original they are. Not impressed? Remember, this is a computer with only 8 colours, and another 8 brighter versions available to it. And to make it worse, only 2 colours could be displayed on any character square, 8 by 8 pixels, on the screen. That's why so many Spectrum games were monochrome, and you can see the programming challenges here when you do attempt to show multiple colours in the same character. The colours bleed into each other, creating this horrible mess. This was called attribute clash, or colour clash, and was an issue on certain 8-bit computers, but worst of all on the Spectrum. For that reason, R-Type blew people away from a graphical standpoint, and it was also very playable. Back in the 80s I was not only gaming but also collecting gaming magazines. Every month I'd buy Your Sinclair, which was a very popular and humorous magazine. This list here, which I'll leave in the video description, shows the top 100 best Spectrum games, as voted by Your Sinclair and its readers. Crash was another one, very popular too, and also Sinclair User was the third magazine I would buy every month. I lived and breathed the Spectrum up until the late 80s. By then though, the computer itself had been far superseded by vastly more powerful computers, like the Atari ST and Commodore Amiga, both of which actually launched way back in 1985. To many today, it probably seems unfathomable that we would suddenly go from this level of graphics to this. But that was what the change from 8-bit computers like the Spectrum and Commodore 64 to 16-bit computers like the ST and Amiga brought. Out went the blocky and monochrome graphics, and in came what was to us back then pretty realistic colour. Wireframe also became flat shaded 3D, bringing yet more realism to our game worlds. But prices of new home computers at launch were often quite prohibitive, coming in north of $1,000. So I finally got my Atari STE in late 1989. The STE was similar in performance to the 1985 ST-FM, but had upgraded sound, and the colour palette now supported 4096 colours, which was the same as the Amiga, instead of only 512 colours in the ST-FM. That also, however, brought a compatibility issue, which prevented some older ST-FM games from running on the new machine. Luckily for me, those games didn't include some of the best games I've ever played in my life. The extra grunt of the 16-bit computers made 3D games much more realistic, like the aforementioned Elite, which I of course played on the new machine. But for me, the game of the format and of the 16-bit era, and the game that ended up as the best-selling game on the ST, was FTL Games' Dungeon Master, which launched in 1987. While it wasn't the first title of the genre, that accolade belongs to 3D Monster Maze on the Sinclair ZX81, which was a precursor to the Spectrum. Dungeon Master was the game that spawned a bunch of dungeon crawler clones, for example the Eye of the Beholder series, which were also great games. It's hard to adequately describe what it felt like crawling through these tight, claustrophobic corridors, knowing that just around the corner could be anything, and frequently anything meant a really tough fight or death for your party of 4 adventurers. Dungeon Master had a cool magic system where you had to cast spells manually by clicking on these runes, figuring out the combinations as you went along, well, sometimes maybe finding scrolls in alcoves or chests. I remember Dungeon Master for one level in particular, level 8, which was sheer hell. Much of it was a large open circle where the level's monsters could see you from far off, and many of them just happened to be immune to normal weapons. So you needed a certain weapon, the Vorpal Blade, and only one particular spell could harm them at all. To make things worse, there were pressure traps on the floor, and the level starts off with a party-killing fireball which teleported along a never-ending path around the level. So you had to be sure to navigate that along with the immune monsters and traps until you find the hidden switch behind a fake wall which turned it off. With amazing real-time graphics and devious puzzle gameplay, Dungeon Master was undoubtedly one of the most influential games ever created. And, well, look at the list of awards that the game received. 1990 brought something completely different. Reading through the magazines, which I was still buying at the time, one game in particular garnered great reviews: The Secret of Monkey Island. In it you played the hapless wannabe pirate, Guybrush Threepwood, in his attempts to become rich and famous so he could win the heart of the governor's daughter, Elaine. My main memory of the game is the hilarious insult sword fighting part, where skill with the sword was less of a requirement than skill with the tongue, insults cutting deeper than the blades themselves. I'm fairly sure the Pirates of the Caribbean movies took a lot of inspiration from this game. And even today, almost 30 years after its first release, the special edition is overwhelmingly positive on Steam. I don't really have any heroes as such, but if I did, Sid Meier would come pretty close to one. The first Sid Meier game I played was Railroad Tycoon on the Atari ST. It was a fantastic game where you started near the beginning of the Industrial Revolution in either the USA or England, laying railroad tracks and joining up cities to mines, lumber mills, etc. The aim wasn't so much to make railroads, but money, and I played it a lot over a year, which is why it's getting a mention here. For sure, it's one of my top, say, 50 favourite games ever. However, It's most notable for introducing me to what is my #1 most played game series, Sid Meier's Civilization. The first Civilization game was, like most games in the 90s, pretty flawed at a mechanics level, and the UI was horrible by today's standards. Balance was whacked too, with diplomats being ridiculously overpowered and able to bribe their way across entire continents, had you enough money. Another flawed mechanic was the D20 roll system, where the attacker would lose on a roll of a 1, regardless of the relevant power versus the defending unit. And that's what spawned the tanks versus spearmen meme that all civers know today. But make no mistake about it, Civilization 1 was still an awesome game, and one which I played for years on end. I'd love to know my gameplay stats on that one, but it must be well over 1,000 hours. By now it's obvious though, around the early 90s, I was playing a lot of RPG and strategy games, especially. But it was time to move on to my next home computer, the Commodore Amiga. To be honest, this is almost a total side grade, but the Amiga was now down to around about $400, and many of my friends also had one, so I had to have one as well. Of course, I instantly bought Civilization for it, but probably the main title on the Amiga for me was Frontier Elite 2, released in 1993. Elite 1 was amazing in that it took you out of our galaxy. Elite 2 was great in that it kept you in our galaxy. A hyper-realistic Newtonian physics rendition of our nearby star systems and the Milky Way. Planets followed orbits around stars and could now be landed on. Missions ranged from trading to assassinations, giving the game extra depth, and the vast array of ships you could pilot, or pirate, had the plaudits flooding in. Like most games, it wasn't without its issues, but Elite 2 was unquestionably another true great from a gameplay and graphical perspective. Remember, this was 1993, and graphics cards barely existed back then. So for a similar reason, worth a mention on the Amiga was Formula 1 Grand Prix, another game which took graphics and realism to the next level, and that was back in 1992. Also in 1992, I had just finished school and had started attending a computer training program. Computers in the business place were still far from ubiquitous in the early 90s, though it was obvious where things were going. So many of these government-funded computer training programs started to appear. Due to my gaming history, I already had a massive advantage over everyone, and through the training program, I ended up with a job in programming. For the first time, I had a little bit of my own money in my pocket, and the first thing I bought with it was a Super Nintendo, or a SNES. The story of this one goes, I walked into a large store in Glasgow which sold some games and the odd bit of electronics. On entering, I looked up at the large screen welcoming shoppers and saw F-Zero being demoed. I walked straight up to it, grabbed a controller, played for 5 minutes, then instantly bought the console with F-Zero coming free. The SNES was different due to its Mode 7 graphics. This pseudo 3D, perhaps more famously known with Super Mario Kart here. This feeling of speed was really unusual in a game of this time, and I just knew I had to have it. The music and the gameplay was even better. Another game well worth noting on the SNES was Super Street Fighter II Turbo Edition, which is, till this day, the best beat 'em up I have ever played. Though granted, I didn't play an awful lot after this. I'd come home from work most days and a bunch of my friends would show up at the house to play Street Fighter. With heroes such as Ken, Ryu, Chun-Li and Guile, ridiculous playability and replayability, Super Street Fighter 2 became one of my favourite games on the SNES. Just look at some of these titles here. Zelda, A Link to the Past, another true great game that I won't even talk about here. Super Mario World, ditto, and obviously Super Mario Kart, which I will get to soon. You can see that Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo, in this kind of company, is something really special. Now, to break from the relentless stream of games and positivity, as I'm sure all of this probably sounds like paradise to some of you. In fact, my later teenage years were pretty troubled. I ended up quitting my programming job and decided to go to university after all, mostly because I needed a fresh start away from my stagnant hometown. I left my SNES behind, but I took my Amiga with me. and for an entire year. In between partying, of course, myself and my next door neighbour Sylvester played this game, Championship Manager 93, to death. Actual death, the death of my Amiga, which by the end of it had been completely burned out. When I wasn't partying and playing Championship Manager 93, I was partying and playing Super Mario Kart with another bunch of guys in the opposite building. Obviously, we're all sitting computing degrees, so everybody I knew loved gaming. And everybody who loved gaming loved Super Mario Kart. We eventually ended up with a TV just for playing it, and another one for watching movies at the same time. Towards the end of uni, one of the guys had imported a Sony PlayStation. Back then, Japan got the new consoles at least a year before anyone else, and Europe was often lagging behind the USA as well. So we either had to wait 18 months or import this stuff direct from Japan if we wanted it early. One of the first games I saw and played on it was Tomb Raider, and yet another huge increase in 3D graphics quality was evident. I really wanted a PlayStation, but I had to wait because the death of my Amiga meant I really needed a new computer, a new personal computer, a new first ever PC. Until around the early to mid 90s, PCs were something of a meme with their crazy high prices, compatibility issues, and backward graphics. This here is CGA, Color Graphics Adapter, and this is EGA, Enhanced Graphics Adapter. VGA and SVGA did exist, and they were on par with the Amiga, but they were still really expensive. But I bought a 486 DX4 100 PC off another of my university neighbours. That 100 stood for 100 MHz. So a 100 MHz chip, while the Amiga and ST were both down around 7 MHz. So the PC was on an entirely different level. The age of the home computer was over, and the age of the personal computer had truly begun. Also, up until this point, the main method of transferring data was still these 3.5-inch floppy disks, but games were so large now that they often required 4 or even more of these disks, and the format was clearly on its last legs. In came the CD-ROM to the rescue, but I had a problem. My PC didn't have one, and I was skint, being a poor university student. So I had just bought this powerful PC, but I didn't have enough money to buy games or even a CD-ROM drive. The internet was just about taking off around this point though, and if you knew where to look, you could get a hold of anything. The answer to my gaming woes was therefore emulation, and I'm quite sure there was also a bit of piracy on top. One game I discovered through emulating the old Spectrum was Doomdark's Revenge. For some bizarre reason, I had missed this absolute gem of a game, which had launched all the way back in 1985. Looking at it even today, it's an incredible piece of programming. The Spectrum only had 48k of memory. This script, even though it's one of my longest, is 46k. In Doomdark's Revenge, the gameplay revolves around 3 characters: Luxor the Moon Prince, Tarithel the Fae, and Rothron the Wise, and it is actually the follow-up to the more critically acclaimed Lords of Midnight, which released the year before. I much preferred Doomdark's Revenge as the world was larger, had more races, and each lord moved and recruited armies on their own, instead of just sitting around in their forts waiting to be recruited by either the protagonist or antagonist. So I bought my first PC, and one of the most played games on it was a 10-year-old Spectrum game. I did finally buy that CD-ROM drive in 1996, when I was forced to due to the release of Sid Meier's Civilization II, the game which meant I could finally stop playing Civilization 1. Civilization would have a huge impact on my life in a way I hadn't yet realised. During uni breaks and every so often for a weekend, I'd make the long drive across Scotland back home. I met up with my old friends again and was invited to a Christmas night out, through which I was introduced to Brian. We shook hands in the taxi and everyone started chatting as usual as we made the trip down to our pub crawl in Ayr on the west coast of Scotland. I can't recall exactly how we got onto the topic of gaming, but it wasn't long before I was talking almost exclusively to Brian. Everybody I knew was a gamer, but few were playing the games that I really loved. Brian was different though. He had an Amiga 1200, which launched in 1992 as the successor to the 500 and 600 models, highlighting games such as Elite 2, Dungeon Master and Civilization. It was clear that I had met my gaming soulmate, and Brian too was living a life of gaming, and not just with computer games. He introduced me to many games such as Dungeons & Dragons and its derivatives, Magic the Gathering and Warhammer, all of which became firm favourites. We played in Warhammer tournaments, including the Grand Tournament in Nottingham for a few years, meeting yet more like-minded gamers. And it wasn't long before there were 5 or 6 of us heading round to his place just to play D&D. Every minute I spent when home from uni, I spent at Brian's place, gaming. University was finally over in 1997, and I was back home. Brian got me a job at his workplace, and my first paycheck, after I'd paid off my debts to my mother and sister from uni, was spent buying that PlayStation I still really wanted. 2 games in particular had caught my eye, Final Fantasy VII and Gran Turismo, but I could only afford one of them. After much deliberation, I opted for Gran Turismo and played it for months, if not years. The greatest driving game I have ever played. You have to realise that back then, graphics like this seemed almost real to us. It seems crazy looking at it today, but this really did seem extremely realistic to us back then. And it was yet another huge step up in quality over anything else we had seen. More than that though, the gameplay in Gran Turismo was absolutely fantastic. You could win cars in races, and when tweaking the tyres and the handling, you could really feel the difference with upgrades. My favourite cars were the Subaru Impreza WRX and the TVR Cerbera, though I'd often end up racing in smaller races with a tweaked out Honda Civic, just for a change. Gran Turismo was something else, and I don't regret my decision to buy it over Final Fantasy VII one bit. Though had I not finally bought Final Fantasy VII a year later, I'd have missed out on what for me is for sure one of my top 5 and possibly one of my top 3 games of all time. I'd never played or even heard of any of the previous Final Fantasy games, but 7 caught my eye with its stunning cutscenes, which were actually shown on TV. Reviews scored very highly too, and the game plays like a fairly typical JRPG even today. What set Final Fantasy VII apart from all others though was the amazing storyline, its music and characters. The main protagonist, however, Cloud Strife, not only had a terrible name, but was also quite weakly written. Other characters like his nemesis Sephiroth and allies like Aeris were instantly hateable, or lovable in Aeris' case. The writing did suffer badly due to being poorly translated from Japanese to English, but the overall storyline was so good it could have been followed even in Japanese. The game's soundtrack was fantastic, with 5 hours of music tracks and each character having their own theme. Major boss fights like Genova were unforgettable due to the high-pressure encounter combined with a racing soundtrack which gave you an unnerving sense of sheer urgency to get on with it. But Final Fantasy VII is mostly remembered by many as a true great for one moment in particular. Please be aware that if you haven't played this game yet, and might, or if you will be looking to pick up Final Fantasy VII Remake scheduled for early next year, the following spoiler will absolutely kill the game for you. I'll put a link to each game in the description below so you can skip this part and go to the next game on my list. Fair warning. Around halfway through the game, while the party pursues Sephiroth, Aeris, the last of an ancient race of people known as the Cetra, meets a brutal death by his sword while praying for Holy, the only entity still left that can save the planet from Sephiroth's and Genova's ruinous plan. Aeris' death was shocking for various reasons, not least of all for she was by that point in the game an extremely potent character and healer, but mostly for the sheer unfairness of it. She'd had a harsh, injustice-filled life and met a similar harsh and unjust ending. Aeris' death was listed number 3 on Screw Attack's Top 10 Oh My God WTF Moments, where it was listed as everyone's first time they cried during a video game. I held back the tears until after the second Genova fight, which this time, instead of having the high pressure racing soundtrack, played out with Aeris' theme haunting the background, and then I broke down, absolutely shattered. It was just so unfair. Why Aeris out of all of the characters? Why her who deserved it the least? At that point, I'd have happily sacrificed Cloud just to bring her back. Looking back at it today, of course I'd never have had it any other way. Without her death, Final Fantasy VII would still have been a true great. With her death, it became something else, a never to be forgotten classic which truly shocked and stunned millions of gamers to their core. The PlayStation had many great games, but Gran Turismo at number 1 and Final Fantasy VII at number 2 were deservedly top of the gaming sales charts at a staggering 10 million sales each. Now, even though I talked about Final Fantasy VII on the PlayStation for some length there, it was a game which only lasted maybe 50 hours or so. My main game time around the end of the 90s was still spent on the PC, and what I call the 4X years. Civilization II was still a game I played heavily, and I actually bought it again for the PlayStation, but there were other truly great 4X games around that time. Master of Orion II released in 1996, and Brian and myself would play that one hot seat, as in he would play his turn, then I played my turn on the same PC before the AI took their turns. Hot seat is a type of gameplay that just doesn't really exist today. Sid Meier was back with Alpha Centauri, which launched in 1999, and for me, it was an even better game than the Civilization games of that era, with truly outstanding writing and a highly imaginative technology tree. That was yet another game where Brian and I played hot seat. But no matter what games we played, we always seemed to end up raising the level of the AI, but still competing against each other. And often the winning strategy revolved around how quickly we could kill off each other's game. In the year 2000, all of that changed, when our combined forces brought, for me at least, one of the top 2 gaming periods of my entire life. Baldur's Gate launched in 1998, and it was a great game. Based on the same 2nd edition Dungeons & Dragons rule set which we all knew. Baldur's Gate 2 though, which launched 2 years later, is possibly the greatest game I have ever played. I was actually caring for my mother at the time, who had suffered a severe stroke the year before. She wasn't completely helpless or anything like that, just a bit forgetful and a potential menace to herself due to that. So I was doing all the cooking, as she would often forget that food was on the stove. Brian was working at a new place in Glasgow, and the usual routine would be he'd come back home around 6 PM, he'd have his dinner, and then I'd pop up to his place around 7, just as my mother had finished hers. So one evening, I went up to see him for some gaming at the usual time, only to be met by his father, who told me there had been an accident and Brian was in hospital. A 200 kilo drum of oil had dropped on his foot, squashing it to a pulp. He actually managed to lift it off him by himself before the ambulance arrived, having spent a few days in hospital and a real danger of losing some toes. But thankfully that didn't happen. He was released and on sick leave for a few months. Now, that may sound like a pretty tough break to you guys, but every cloud has a silver lining. And what a silver lining this was, as it allowed us to play Baldur's Gate 2 almost every minute of the day we could, for weeks on end. By this point, Brian had 2 PCs, one for him and one for me. Normally I got his older parts whenever he upgraded, which was frequently. Baldur's Gate 2 was one of the first games we played that allowed for LAN play. And rather than one person controlling the party of 6, as is how the game is usually played, we figured out a way to play 3 characters each at the same time. Not only that, but it worked absolutely perfectly. I played the main protagonist, a wizard, and if any major plot storyline happened, it would be seen on both of our screens. But otherwise, we could walk around towns, buying gear, etc. If anything required the entire party to be there, like for example a really tough fight,
you must gather your party before venturing forth.
The game was smart enough to know and wouldn't let us continue on until the entire party was together. Baldur's Gate 2 is memorable for the fantastic storyline, the amazing combat system, especially the magic system, which was extremely powerful and comprehensive, comprising every spell in the D&D rulesbook. The antagonist, John Irenicus, remains one of the truly great and evil villains in gaming history. But travelling through the world of Faerun and then the Underdark, you will meet plenty in that ilk. The expansion pack, Throne of Baal, continued where you left off and ended up with the protagonist ascending to godhood as a rightful heir to the god of murder. You could of course choose to deny your birthright and do something a little bit more peaceful, if you wanted. The stories, the characters, the music. Back in the day, BioWare, you were great. You were truly, truly great. Civilization 3 launched in 2001, retaining the 5-year cadence of the Civilization series. What can I say except we played it religiously, just like with all the rest. Civ 3 isn't the most popular game in the series, but for me it was another huge step forward. The music as well was absolutely superb. Then, in 2002, another great from BioWare, and another game that would end up changing my life. Neverwinter Nights was based on the updated 3rd edition Advanced Dungeons & Dragons rule set. To be frank, the single player campaign was pretty weak and nowhere near BioWare's usual standards. However, the game shipped with the Aurora toolset, which allowed people to create custom multiplayer modules for the game. This was 2001 and Lord of the Rings, the movie, had released 6 months earlier. And modders began to release a large number of modules based on that, rather than the Forgotten Realms, which was the usual setting for the D&D rules. Brian often instigated whatever games we played. He had more money than me at that time and would often turn up with a new game every couple of weeks. And again, we started off playing Neverwinter on the LAN, controlling a character each throughout the campaign. It wasn't long though before we were playing multiplayer online. Everything had come together in the early 2000s. The internet had exploded in popularity. The network backbone was improving rapidly. Most people had finally got DSL or ADSL, so dial-up modems were thankfully a thing of the past. And now finally, the tools arrived to make truly amazing multiplayer experiences. I had played stuff like Diablo 2 online previous to this, but it wasn't really the same as Neverwinter Nights. Player versus player was now a real thing. So were factions versus factions, as the Knights of Gondor and Riders of Rohan fought against the evil Haradrim and Mordor. That was other people, at least. I was something of a lone wolf in those days, preferring to go it solo. Neverwinter was a great game for its brilliant toolset and the effort that the modding community put into it. And it started off my MMO period, which I'm still in today somewhat. But the main reason I remember it is it's the game where I first met Jenny, my partner of the last 10 years. The more games I enjoyed though, the harder it became to focus on one. I'd still play Master of Orion II and Civilization 3, of course. The Total War series was also heavily played. In particular, my favourite of the entire series, even today, Medieval 2. Morrowind was another game that instantly grabbed my imagination and forced me to buy my first proper graphics card, a GeForce MX 440. On top of the PC games, Brian and I were still attending Warhammer tournaments, still playing Magic and Dungeons & Dragons. Everything in my gaming life was great, with the exception of Master of Orion 3, which I previously declared as the game I was most pumped for, ever. Launching in 2003, it turned out a disaster which killed the series. Luckily, there were plenty of alternatives to play. Later on, Jenny would remark that in the early years between 2002 and 2005, I'd often just disappear off games, or hibernate for the winter, as she said. The reality here was, I had become extremely depressed caring for my mother with no obvious end in sight. Gaming had become my escape, and I threw myself into every game in ways that were just unhealthy. This was never more obvious than with the third of my personal greatest games ever, the World of Warcraft. I missed the very start of World of Warcraft due to hibernating, and my first attempt to get into the game failed somewhat, as I rolled a rogue and they aren't the easiest class to level. A couple of months later, Jenny asked me what I was playing and if I'd come back to WoW. I told her that I didn't really like the game, and her response was, "What the? How can you not like WoW?" So I gave it another try. a fresh start on a new character, a retribution paladin called Adored. In Neverwinter, I chose to play the Lone Wolf. In WoW, I was forced to play it. You see, if any class in WoW was ever a meme, the Ret Paladin was it. For most people, paladins were not the holy warrior that you might imagine one would be. They were just goddamned awful, in fact, only useful for healing. So if you didn't heal on your paladin, then you weren't welcome in guilds, and you'd never get a raid spot. So almost everyone respect to Holy Paladin at the end game. Almost everyone. Me? I embraced my black sheep reputation and PvP'd like my life depended on it. Alone, of course, because nobody wanted a Ret Paladin in their PvP groups either. And back in the early days of Vanilla WoW, the raid leader could kick people out of battlegrounds, and I frequently was. That just made me even more determined to succeed, so I grinded the best PvP gear I could get my hands on, playing Alterac Valley for 24 hours straight. The same battle, that is. Back then in WoW, one of the battlegrounds was called Alterac Valley. It was a massive 40v40 PvP massacre where the Alliance and Horde fought over towers with the end goal of killing the opposing general. Games lasted days on end and swung from one part of the battlefield to another, and there I was, the lone Ret Paladin, standing at the front of the melee with all the warriors and rogues where I deserved to be. Never before and never since had I tried so hard to stand out and do the impossible, but I did. Ret Paladins were pretty awful, but could be pushed to limits by skilled and determined people. And I made a name for myself, especially on the WoW EU forums where I was known as knowledgeable, though also highly arrogant, but skilled and an undergeared Ret Paladin. I never got to raid. I barely got to even 5-man in normal dungeon groups. But few Horde ever wanted to meet me in the open world, and I would let nothing get in my way. Nothing apart from Civilization 4. If Civilization is the best game series of all time, Civilization 4 is the best of the series. Released in 2005, it took some getting used to the changes, and the cartoony graphics weren't for everyone, but over its series of expansions, Civ 4 became a true great. By the time the first WoW expansion, the Burning Crusade, came around in 2007, I had burned out on proving myself to people who simply didn't want to listen. I still played Paladin but was now Protection Spec and ended up finding a guild that was willing to take me on as a Paladin tank. Luckily, as it ended up, as Paladins were actually fairly good tanks in the Burning Crusade. Later on though, I'd move off that server, along with Jenny and Brian, to another server, and this time I was back playing on the Rogue. I talked previously about Baldur's Gate 2 being one of the top 2 gaming periods of my life, where myself and Brian and his mangled foot played the game for weeks on end. The other great gaming period of my life was during Warcraft Burning Crusade. All 3 of us joined the same guild and raided 3 times a week for 3 or 4 hours each. We went through Karazhan, Gruul's and Magtheridon's lairs, Serpent Shrine Cavern, the Eye and its epic fight against Kael'thas, and for me, Hyjal Summit, before I burned out again. The other 2 completed Black Temple before they were finished. And for all 3 of us, it was never the same again. Brian enjoyed the next expansion, The Wrath of the Lich King. I joined in later, but never really got into it as much. We all started looking for some new MMO to play, and we found varying levels of fun, depending on what we enjoyed most. One of the earlier ones was Lotro, Lord of the Rings Online, the official version this time, which came in 2007. Lotro was a nice game, I guess, but nothing to get overly excited about. It did have one great expansion, Meier. Next up was Age of Conan, a really fun game for the first 20 levels, which were very high quality. The rest of the game though just wasn't finished, and it was a real letdown. Age of Conan also holds a dubious title as the only game where I ever rage quit during PvP, so unbalanced was that game. Next up was Warhammer Age of Reckoning, an absolutely tremendous PvP game with no real PvE. Warhammer was the best PvP I'd ever played in any MMO, bar none. The scenarios were different class, with varying goals like the usual capture the flag, but this time with a difference. Holding the flag too long drained you of your health at an increasing rate. That was Morrowind, a tremendous battleground. My favourite, however, was Tor Anrock, where order and chaos fought over lava pits, and classes with knockbacks had a huge advantage. My dwarf, Ironbreaker, already near impossible to kill, became a real menace on the attack too. PvP was just so damn good, with one major flaw. A flaw I'd start to see more and more in upcoming MMOs. Game balance is something I feel very strongly about. Having been a WoW player for years, I'm well aware of how bad it can be. There are generally two types of balance in an MMO. You've got class balance, so that's balance between your classes like rogues, paladins, mages, warriors, hunters, etc. And the second type of balance is faction balance. In Warcraft, that's alliance versus horde. In Warhammer, order versus destruction. In Star Wars The Old Republic, that's the Republic versus the Sith. Over time, more players, and a certain type of player, gravitated towards the bad guys. Horde came to dominate PvP in WoW due to having vastly superior racial talents for PvP. Examples were Warstomp, the Tauren ratio which allowed one player to stun multiple players. Will of the Forsaken, which made them, the Forsaken, immune to fear and charm, which are two huge PvP mechanics. The Orc stun resist ratio, stuns being the only mechanic that never breaks on damage. All the while, the Alliance got useless crap like Wisp form while dead. Yep, you're faster when you're dead, which will be a lot because the Horde have vastly better PvP ratios. Living through all this, it was obvious that the good guys were having a hard time, and that hard time would continue. When Warhammer launched, the game developers, Mythic, they were told that destruction would dominate all the servers simply based on numbers. They had also made them far too sexy, with witch elves and sorceresses being far more attractive than any other classes. What happened? The same people who were attracted to winning with Horde were attracted to destruction, and order got rolled in server after server. This was based purely on the fact that destruction had 2/3 of the population. I couldn't stand it and I just gave up. Warhammer was an absolutely fantastic PvP experience ruined by awful game balance and terrible decision making. So I was back again in Warcraft for Cataclysm in 2010. Again, I joined in late and while it was fun again, it just wasn't the same as Vanilla or TBC or even Wrath of the Lich King. WoW was undoubtedly getting worse over time. Thankfully though, Civ 5 had just released. Sadly, it wasn't a patch on Civ 4 and took until the very last expansion before it could be called a really great game. Which, to be fair, Civ 5 ended up, but even my rock civilization was starting to let me down. Mythic were at it again in 2011, releasing Star Wars The Old Republic. You probably know where this one is going. The same people who were attracted to Horde and Destruction were back again, playing the Sith this time. Mythic made their choice easy by giving them lightning while the Republic got pebbles. Everyone except Mythic, it seemed, knew what was going to happen. And it did happen.
There were several problems with the implementation, but key among them was that there is a huge faction imbalance going on in many of the servers in Star Wars The Old Republic. On some servers, the Empire outnumbers the Republic over a 2-to-1 ratio, and this just caused massive zerging. There wasn't proper, caps on the population put in so that, it could limit how many of one side versus the other side would go in, and, it just created mayhem. The Empire was just zerging the other side, farming the Republic, and there was actually a nasty little bug that actually allowed the Empire or one of the sides to get into, the spawn point of the enemy, and so they could actually just sit right where the players were spawning and just camp them over and over and over again.
After the vastly outnumbered Republic were camped at Ilum, the endgame PvP, server after server, the numbers dwindled down to nothing. There was no way I was hanging around for that, and I also quit. Another good game ruined by awful faction balance, and Mythic were to blame again. So we're back in WoW, and Pandaria launched in 2012. Jenny and I joined in late. For many though, including Brian, Pandaria was the final straw. They just didn't like the idea of pandas, though Pandaren had actually been part of Warcraft lore for some time. I actually enjoyed the Pandaria expansion, but by this point in WoW, I was clearly a filthy casual. I did a bit of PvP, got crushed by the Horde, did some 5-man dungeons, got bored, and started looking again for the next big MMO. Guild Wars 2 came in 2012. It was alright. Brian continues to play it till this day. The graphics were great, but there was something missing for me, the sense of progression. The main progression metric in most MMOs is gear. The gear that you wear, which makes you better, more powerful. Guild Wars 2 had a kinda weird system that gave you access to all armour sets to PvP with, so gear progression wasn't really much of a thing. Without that, there was nothing really to entice many of us back to it after reaching maximum level. Next up was WildStar, famous mostly for being the game that launched AdoredTV. Yep, I'm serious. I have a handful of WildStar PvP videos from 2014. I only really played WildStar up till about the halfway point, but I was something of a PvP monster on both my Spellslinger, Adored, and my Engineer, Dabby, who was unkillable unless you brought an army with you. You should watch those videos, I was pretty good back then. Spellslingers were so overpowered though, and more people started playing them. I ended up campaigning to have them nerfed, my own class, but the devs had other ideas. WildStar was a fun game with really great fun PvP, but the balance just wasn't quite there. So I'm back in WoW, this time for Warlords of Draenor. I started a new account, recruited Jenny and her kids, and we all played through the entire levelling process up to level 110. It was fun, but yeah, you know the story by now. World of Warcraft Legion came in 2016. Jenny and I joined in later. It was fun, but Civilization VI also launched in 2016, an absolutely awful aberration of a game. 3 years later, and it's little better. And I wonder if this is the Master of Orion 3 moment, the game that kills the franchise. We all jumped into Elder Scrolls Online around 2017. It's fun for a few months, but also suffers from the same lack of progression seen in Guild Wars 2. One issue being the exact gear you want is just a little bit too easy to get. And then finally, for the MMO years, Warcraft's Battle of Azeroth launched in 2018. From what I've heard, it's not at all fun. I wouldn't know as I haven't bought the expansion, and this time, unlike with every other time, from Burning Crusade to Wrath to Cataclysm to Pandaria to Draenor, and even Legion, I have zero intention of buying Battle for Azeroth. Getting towards the end of this extremely long and involved video, I will look at what went wrong with my life of gaming. First of all, I believe strongly that games are getting worse. Not the graphics or the production quality, of course that's getting better every year, but the gameplay is just not as good. I'm sure you've heard this before, but have you ever thought about doing a comparison of games? Well, here's mine. Dungeon Master launched in 1987. I guess the closest game to it today would be Legend of Grimrock, which I bought and played for 4 hours. It was alright, but Dungeon Master is a better game. I'm not talking about it being better based on the fact that it's 30 years old. I'm just saying it's a better game, period. Given the 30-year gap, that really shouldn't be the case. Sid Meier's Alpha Centauri. As I said, probably the best 4X game, which launched in 1999. Sid Meier's Beyond Earth launched 15 years later, to mixed reviews. Alpha Centauri is the better game. Today, it's the better game. Sure, the UI is bad and the graphics are straight out of 1999, but in terms of gameplay and story, it is a mile ahead. Baldur's Gate 2, the year 2000. Pillars of Eternity, 15 years later. It's a nice game, and I played 22 hours of it before losing interest. If I look at my Baldur's Gate 2 Enhanced Edition, I played that for 25 hours this year. A game I've already beaten multiple times. The UI is clunky, the graphics are eye-wateringly bad, but it's the better game. By far. Civilization 4 versus Civilization 6. Let's just let Steam do the talking. Civilization 4, overwhelmingly positive, 95% rating. Civilization 6, mixed, with a rating of 69%. Why, Sid? They've both got your name on it. Why are your games getting worse over time? Other examples I could mention? Deus Ex, Another superb game I didn't even highlight here. The original game is far better than any of the newer titles. It's just a better game with a vastly better story. Mass Effect 1, 2 and 3 is some of the best games I ever played, yet didn't even include in this video until now. Mass Effect Andromeda? Yeah, it was okay, but compared to the previous trilogy? Not only that, but in some ways the graphics were worse than the originals. What happened to you, BioWare? WoW today versus WoW 10 or 15 years ago? It's no contest. The game today looks much better, the animations are smoother, the sounds and production, all miles ahead of the old game. But it has no soul and no community. Both ripped out of the game as Blizzard tried to cater to the millions of casuals who think they know what they want. I got access to my old account, which started in 2005 and pretty much came to an end at Pandaria. Though to be honest, I'd say 3/4 of the playtime on that account happened between 2005 and 2009. Basically from vanilla to Burning Crusade. You can count the days played on characters just by typing /played. Here's my old human paladin, Adored, with 45 days played. That's actual days, as in 45 days multiplied by 24 hours. 1,080 hours played on one character, and I barely even played her during the Burning Crusade. My other paladin here, Spica, was my Horde Blood Elf paladin with 42 days played. So there's another 1,000 hours playing a different paladin. Here's my most played character, Adored, the Rogue. This is the one that I raided with most during the Burning Crusade. 50 days. That is another well over 1,000 hours on a single character. Here's my second rogue, Capella, another Horde Blood Elf with 21 days played. And here's my human priest, Risha, which I played during the Lich King. Another 21 days played. But after that, things really tailed off, and most had 10 days or less played. Denibola, my warlock, 10 days played during Cataclysm, I think. Vino Calypso, my mage, 9 days during Pandaria. And then finally, all the way to Equalize, yet another paladin, my final paladin, and 12 days played during Legion. Overall in World of Warcraft, I have played over 300 days. That is 7,000 hours. And the vast majority of that came during the first 4 years. The question is, did I just burn out, or did the game get worse over time? Well, all of these examples are just really examples off the top of my head, based on the games that I have played in my life. Even if I remove World of Warcraft burnout from the equation, there's still no question in my mind that games are getting worse over time. And we cannot continue to excuse this just because graphics are naturally improving over time. So what's going to happen next? Is this the end for my gaming career, my life of gaming? Not quite. In March next year, Final Fantasy VII will be remade. Will it be enough for me to go and buy a PlayStation 4 though? I guess we'll see. During Google's recent Stadia presentation, the first game announced for the platform was Baldur's Gate 3. That shouldn't be too far out. And finally, World of Warcraft Classic. Blizzard going back to the roots of the game, back to vanilla, starting fresh, and it launches next week. There's a reason why these old games are coming back now. Great games never die. I reserved character names for WoW Classic last week, and at one point there were 10,000 people in the queue just to reserve names. Myself, Brian and Jenny already got our characters reserved. But remaking this old stuff will only last us so long. We need to get back to making great original games again. VR needs to take off properly. Can you imagine playing an MMO in VR? Instead of pressing a key to cast a spell, you're using hand gestures to cast, just like in Street Fighter 2. Hell, if I need to shout out, then I'm up for that as well. Technology has progressed so much that you can play all of these old titles online, in your browser. But we need the next level for the PC, which has to be real 3D or virtual reality. It's been too damn long. So, to wrap this one up, first of all, there's no way I could possibly mention every game I ever played, and I'm quite certain I've left out something that really should have been in there. Some people would say I've wasted my life gaming. For sure, there were dark periods when I was heavily depressed, and to be honest, I'm not even sure if the gaming helped or hindered during that time, but it was certainly an escape. Perhaps I also used it to escape some of my responsibilities though, and I know I've met a lot of very depressed people playing Warcraft, and that would make a good study, I think. But on the flip side, without gaming, I'd probably never have started programming, and I'd never have got programming jobs. In fact, I have now run multiple businesses based around IT and computing, the reason for which is my life of gaming. Without it, I'd never have met my best friend for 20 odd years, Brian, and I'd never have met Jenny during Neverwinter Nights, which means I'd never have moved to Sweden, and I probably wouldn't have this YouTube channel today. If this has been a waste of a life, it feels like it's been worth it. Maybe I'm just one of the lucky ones, but I regret none of it. If you're early 20s or younger watching this, you might be thinking to yourself, no way will I still be gaming at 40 plus. We'll see about that. I had a week's vacation at the start of this month, and I'm taking my second week at the end. You heard what I said, right? WoW Classic is launching on the 27th. I missed the start of every World of Warcraft launch and expansion, but not this time. And while I was sorely tempted to roll a Ret Paladin again, not this time. It will likely be a rogue. Maybe I'll even record some gameplay. Really finally for this gaming focused video, I have some keys to give away for a cool little game called Robo Instructus. Remember I said I was going on vacation and taking my laptop to do some coding? Well, Alex, the author of this new game, contacted me and gave me a key to try it out. I actually had some fun with it, as did my stepson who is also learning Python, and the game is currently sitting with a 90% positive rating on Steam, with 22 reviews. It's just launched, and as a disclaimer, Alex didn't request anything of me, this was my idea to hold the competition. So I've got 3 Steam keys, one of which you can win simply by entering the competition in the description below. I think you have to sign in with YouTube, but that's it. Good luck with that, and the winners will be picked within a week. And I'll be back before long. Until then, I'll catch you later, guys.